Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are streaming in, joining us live from wherever you are in the world. It's a wet morning here in Lagos, Nigeria. It's been raining since about 2 a.m. But again, we're streaming live, so that's nice. Thank you very much, Shem. Thank you, Andre. I want to say thank you to the partners at Future City Foundation for this opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity. You're welcome, participants from Nigeria and other parts of the world. I'll be taking this address and we'll just be cutting through some things, trying to make it as brief as possible for something as controversial as what Andre and Shem wants me to deal with. By the way, we'll be just doing some level of introduction, then looking at housing right now in the changed world that we live in. Also, we'll be looking at housing finance, not so much as a deep dive, but looking at what it's like for Nigeria, particularly. Then, of course, the meat of our discussion and, setting the tone for the panelists. We'll be looking at, sustainability and affordability in terms of housing, looking at it as a paradox, the framework, then making some recommendations, then, would conclude. So as a start, I think right now it's not news to anyone, the kind of environment that we're living in. Nigeria is not also excluded from that. We're living in a world where things are quite uncertain. Before now, you wouldn't think your house would turn into your office full time. And you wouldn't think your employers will be begging you to come back into the office. So, I mean, that's the environment that we're in. And with that, we are beginning to see housing and real estate play a focal part in the current world that we live in. Not just for finance, but again, too, in managing public health, in managing mental health, in managing work relations, in protecting investments and things like that. So in this volatile world, the uncertainty, complex and ambiguous situation that we find ourselves through, we're beginning to see that all of this rises and falls on housing, availability of it, affordability of it, and again, how sustainable it is to provide for a good number of the population, as it were. I mean, when we talk about this, sustainability and affordability, these are concepts that don't exist in a vacuum. And when we're talking about housing, we need to look at a couple of things. In a typical standard, functional environment, which of course we've left behind since COVID, critical things like consumer confidence and disposable income impact the availability, supply and demand of real estate. It's pretty much, I mean, to walk away from, not talking too much about the economics of it, but again, we can see what the current environment has kind of like unleashed, so consumer confidence has been beaten up, business confidence has been beaten up as well. But again, you still have opportunities inside this with regards to real estate demand and housing and, with cost rising and things like that. So in a typical environment, these indices and fundamentals begin to play. And when they play, they determine how sustainable and how affordable housing, can be. If business confidence is down, you can tell the impact on housing. You could tell the impact on the overall economy. As well, various governments trying to, do what they can to exacerbate the impact. For instance, the Central Bank of Nigeria has rolled out a 5-year program to combat the effects of the pandemic on the economy, which would include, of course, the rollout of an infrastructure, a 3 trillion naira infrastructure fund, with a good deal of that being allocated to housing. I mean, that begins to tell you, the demand the impact and the likes. Of course, if we narrow this down, you want to begin to look at how these indices interplay. You look at Nigeria, for instance. We had a recession sometime in 2020. Of course, it was a COVID-induced recession, like most parts of the world. We're just coming out of that in the first quarter of 2021, and growing slightly at 0.51%. You can also see our consumer confidence was really beat up during COVID. We're trying to pull out of that. It's a positive growth, though it's still in the negative territory. But of course, that tells you, of course, people are beginning to gain some level of confidence on the back of the economy opening up back. Inflation, the story is pretty much the same. Of course, it's just trying to taper off recently at 17.93%, still one of the highest we've had in recent times. Unemployment, of course, that story is, we've had our own fair share of what Andre was trying to talk about. We had our youth on the streets, just not too long ago. And of course, these are all things coming from the variables interplaying, with the economy and affecting, how people are able to understand sustainability and affordability, particularly with the new level of requirements. If we deep down a bit more to the population, and of course, you're beginning to see certain things. Nigeria is playing a key part in the world right now in terms of population growth and as a growing market. Currently, we're at over 200 million people. 105 million of that is situated in the urban centers. So of course, there's pressure on infrastructure, pressure on housing. In fact, currently it's roughly 600 persons per 220 persons per kilometer square, or 600 persons per square meter. I mean, that's if there is no other definition for population density. I don't know how else you begin to look at that, but that's the reality, playing off of these variables. But they're dovetailing straight into population, how this is playing out with regards to real estate and housing. So from that, we want to look at how is this playing on the housing finance market. Typical segments like you would have. Of course, the leading segment in Nigeria, the residential real estate market. It comprises almost about 70%, 65 to 70% of property demand and investment. Then, of course, you have commercial real estate. Commercial real estate, of course, centered around key cities like Lagos, Abuja, Kaduna, and the rest of them. But of course, there is a huge opportunity, of course, likewise in residential housing, where certain parts of that segment and that market has not been, unfolded. So we're beginning to look at things like business parks, warehousing, student housing in particular, to deal with the shortfall in human capital development requirements. And of course, right now with the situation, the rise in land banking and of course, people parking their investments in land for appreciation and protection and things like that. So, but if you look on the other side, you begin to understand the fundamentals of what we were talking about earlier with regards to the population. About 70 to 80% of housing and real estate demand falls under the lower middle to lower class population. That demand is something that needs to be looked at. I mean, if you're talking about affordability and sustainability, these are the areas. This is where the demand is. This is where, where the proverbial shoe pinches. And you can't begin to talk about that if you're not looking at this segment. And this is the key part where the government is beginning to consider intervention and doing what they are currently doing in terms of providing houses and and investment to jumpstart the economy. Deep down, if we begin to look at that, off of just what we've seen, a good portion of the population in Nigeria, which is about, over 80, 90%, are within what you would want to call the bottom of the pyramid segment, where housing is, a bit of a high requirement, so to speak, because you have an income band of people doing about $1,000, the equivalent of about $1,000 a year in income. A very small population are doing, more than that, which of course is the upper class. And then you begin to look at, okay, how this is affecting our supply and demand. We will later go into, of course, the issues in the market and things that are affecting, the market, and how possible is it for us to be able to do housing in a sustainable and affordable manner. From looking at, assembly of land, then of course regulations, of course the debt of infrastructure and all of that. Around these are things that are impacting the ability of the market to provide ample supply or determine what level of the population that supply should tilt towards, and things like that. Already stated, as I was saying, of course, these are the market impediments. How do you deal with these impediments if you want to promote affordable housing, you want to promote sustainability in housing provision? Long-term funding issues are pretty much at the neck of developers, also at the neck of subscribers, people that want to, acquire these homes. Financing standards. I do know currently, of course, as part of the intervention working with the World Bank, we've tried to introduce different levels of financing standards to aggregate the demand in the market. For instance, we have uniform underwriting standards for the formal and informal sector, non-interest sector, and things like that. So these are interventions happening in the market, of course, at the back of these impediments. Of course, title issue, land issues. I mean, how do you begin to deal with things like that? Then you're talking about a fragmented market with different stakeholders playing. It's not enough that you have title. It's not enough that you have finance. How do you deliver sustainably? Then, of course, on the back of that, if you look on the other side, Nigeria is only dwarfed by China and India in terms of the availability of substandard housing, which is a key issue. If we begin to look at, these indices, what is the market looking at? What is the market, beginning to tell us? Income ratios are lower than rents as it is across the world, not just Nigeria. More people want to access credit, more people want to access mortgage. Real house prices are hitting the roof on the back of the pandemic. And of course, we were just coming out of a recession not too long, global recession not too far behind. Then, of course, the pandemic hits. And then housing is at the focal and the forepoint of these issues. And then house prices are rising. Of course, population growth as well. Then, if we look at the finance side of things, it is no longer being looked at as an essential infrastructure. It's a means for financial investments and things like that, the financialization of housing. So you still have investments, banks and things like that happening with housing. So housing as a product itself, it's gone beyond just providing infrastructure. So if we look at our own environment, I just talked about the COVID-induced recession. So if you see that graph, the deep steep that you see there was the COVID-induced recession, and how it impacted real estate, housing, and even construction activity. But we've pulled out of that. We dipped back in, we pulled out of that in 2021. And we're thinking that, of course, with growth in these sectors, looking at the demand is 17 to 20 million housing demand that is not even catered for with regards to, I mean, the 17 to 20 million demand in Nigeria is just residential housing demand. We've not looked at the demand in terms of office space, student housing, and the likes. So you begin to see the opportunity that exists within that space. Those are just the indices. Then we want to begin to talk about the meat of the issue, just setting the tone for the panelists, not doing too much for them, but allowing them to come in, but we'll just talk about a few things. So when people talk about housing affordability and sustainability, I mean, it looks like a paradox. But of course, the beauty of a paradox is your ability to investigate it and then bring out the opportunities that lie in it. And, people are beginning to see that, of course, this is not just a paradox, it's also an opportunity. And one of the things that are happening right now is our ability to look at housing sustainability and affordability, go beyond the paradox and look at the opportunities. It's going beyond the cost of the delivery of houses to look at the overall cost of running that house, and of course, the overall cost of housing on the environment, as it were. Housing is, according to the World Bank, responsible for close to 30 to 40% greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, it is important that you deal with sustainability when you are looking at things like that. So in recent times, the major framework that has been in the offing for dealing and being able to manage this paradox and bring out results, as it were, has been the SDGs. We want to deep down look at, how does this happen? So of course, to deliver on housing affordability and sustainability, you would need a framework. It's not enough that you are able to access finance. It's not enough that you are able to build a solid home that is, very expensive. But of course, it has to cater to very critical things. So using that framework, a sustainable and affordable home would naturally be a green home. But of course, that's where the argument lies. People will tell you sustainability is not cheap. Affordability should be cheap. But of course, the balance is what is critical. And the balance is where we begin to talk about green homes. So for affordability, you need to begin to look at what's the performance of the building, what's the performance of that house. Typically from our studies and engagement and as a sustainability consultant, we've come to understand that a typical greenhouse, looking beyond the cost of construction, should be able to pay back, itself over a 30-year period, looking at the savings from running that home with regards to power, with regards to water, and then with regards to maintenance. And then again, you want to look at the health benefits that come to building green, looking at the quality of air in the house, particularly within the ambits of a global pandemic. This is very critical, and this is what is driving the demand for housing. Of course, durability, we can't talk too much about that, of course. Then again, finance. So for housing to be sustainable, you need to be able to attract long-term cheap funding. The framework for a lot of practitioners is to be able to bring in impact investing into the housing space. How do you do that? You need to be able to map your ability to deliver green housing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, these are about 17 different goals, which housing answers about 9 to somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 of these goals, depending on how you deliver housing. If you deliver housing with off-grid electricity using solar, you can hit as much as 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then you have indices to match off impact that would attract impact investors to want to, to play in that space. So, I mean, this is the framework for the future. And I know that the panelists are going to deal with different facets and different aspects of this, from designing to construction to delivery So maybe possibly finance as well, so we wouldn't dwell too much on that. But of course, this is setting the tone on what it is for us to be able to deliver on a sustainable and affordable methodology. So in wrapping up, using the framework is very critical. So that framework would involve the use of methodologies like LEED, BREEAM, and then of course we have a local variant, the Building Energy and Efficiency Codes that is being used right now in Nigeria. We also have the international measure that is being sponsored by the World Bank, promoted by the World Bank and the IFC, the EDGE measure. The EDGE measure has a very broad like LEED and BREEAM as well, a methodology for addressing what an affordable home should be. Then of course, like we're talking, it's not just the construction part of it. There is need for product innovation. We're beginning to look at things like non-interest lending, blended options for finance. So, I mean, you could get access to impact finance, blend it with commercial rates, and be able to provide property at an affordable rate. Mortgage syndications, the provision of mortgage guarantees, that's happening in Nigeria. That's very common already in India, very common in Malaysia. I think Hong Kong has that happening as well, and China and Canada, of course, and the US. Nigeria, we just launched the framework, and hopefully that is something that will begin to make sustainability and housing affordability happen. Policy intervention, very critical. Like I said, housing affordability and sustainability is not just lying on the provision of housing and then the finance side of it. There's the policy intervention that is required. I know part of those in the network, like those in Ghana and in Kenya, are beginning to adopt green methodologies. And if you're building green, the government would reduce your approval taxes, would enable you build, high density buildings. And, also beginning to look at how to introduce other policies as well, like, management of rents of houses that have been provided to, manage sustainability and impact on the environment. These are policy interventions that, has to be thrown into the mix for us to be able to deliver sustainably. Of course, the production approach to housing delivery hasn't changed much, particularly in this part of the world, but of course it's moving forward. The ability to be able to deliver a large scale using prefab tech, ability to deliver, large numbers, assemble housing, and not just do the typical, mix and batching type of delivery. I mean, if housing delivery has to be sustainable, we have to look at a production approach. Production approach would improve the quality. Production approach would reduce the time to market, and all of these have impact on the bottom line. And of course, we'll be closing regardless. This is where, part of what the Good Cities Foundation has been working on, the use of technology. PropTech, Nigeria is currently just behind South Africa in Africa as one of the leading markets for property technology. Then, of course, the use of blockchain, the application of blockchain is also helping to address the issues that we're having with property rights. Right now, we are working with leaders in that environment, like House Africa, where we can improve on traditional lands. Markets like India have gone far, far ahead with regards to the use and application of PropTech and blockchain. And this is, things that we're beginning to look at, and we need to adapt to be able to, provide sustainable and affordable housing in Nigeria. On a parting note, I know the panelists are going to do justice to these things, but like we've said, housing sustainability and affordability is not a paradox. It lies in our ability to see the opportunities and value and map them and replicate them in our delivery of housing. Thank you very much.